Greetings and welcome to the annual Della Hardman Day program, our first since 2018 due to the COVID-19 pandemic last year. My name is Andrea Taylor, Della's eldest child and a seasonal resident of the Vineyard. We are delighted that you've joined us for this annual summer event that began 16 years ago in 2005 when Della's former students at West Virginia State University, now many of whom are retired, organized a tribute to her on the island to thank her for the support and influence she had on their lives and careers. Later that year, Della passed at age 83, and the town of Oak Bluff subsequently declared the last Saturday in July as Della Hardman Day in perpetuity to celebrate her civic and artistic contributions to the island community and her love of its people and beauty during a lifetime as a visitor and subsequently a permanent resident for the last 20 years of her life. Before we begin today's special program, I'd like to recognize our many supporters, including the Vineyard Gazette, where Della wrote the weekly Oak Bluffs column for a decade, the Featherstone Center for the Arts that serves as our fiscal sponsor, and the Martha's Vineyard Regional High School, which sponsored previously the essay contest for the Della Hardman Day that we hope to revive with the support of the Rotary and others in 2022. And then I would like to give a very special thank you to Gretchen Underwood, who is our honorary chair of the Della Hardman Day celebration, who led this effort tirelessly and enthusiastically and graciously through 2019. And finally, the program is dedicated to the memory of Esther Hopkins, who lived from 1926 to 2021. She was an African-American chemist and environmental attorney, Boston University alumni, and a former trustee who retired to the island several years ago and served as the founding chair of Della Hardman Day. We are grateful for her leadership. Della was a native of West Virginia, and she made her first visit to the Vineyard in 1925 with her father, Anderson H. Brown, an entrepreneur. And we have a photo of her on the Oak Bluffs ferry dock that is included in her archival collection at Boston University. More than 20 years later, she returned to Boston as a graduate student at BU, and then she returned to the island in retirement and really completing her lifetime relationship with this magical island. Della loved the Vineyard and its people, and as an artist, scholar, and writer, she was inspired by its beauty and serenity. And as an active community member, she served on numerous boards and committees, and most of all, she connected to its people, especially young people. And she introduced many, many visitors to the magic of the island of Martha's Vineyard. She loved life, she loved the island and its people, and today we're pleased to resume this celebration of her legacy and to remind us of her oft-repeated advice to savor the moment. Now I'm delighted to welcome Charlayne Hunter-Gault, a seasonal Vineyard resident and an award-winning global journalist who will lead today's conversation with our special guest, Ibram X. Kendi, my colleague at Boston University, followed by a poignant reflection about Della from her former neighbor, beloved storyteller, Susan Klein. Charlayne?
Thank you so much, Andrea. It's a great pleasure to me to do two things today. The first is to honor our dear, now ancestor friend, Della Hardman, who lives not only in the land of the ancestors now, but in all of our hearts. I have so many memories of her Oak Bluffs column in particular, but especially when she used to drop by in between her reporting, and sometimes it would be late at night. And she would say, oh, you know, there's a jazz group I want to hear, but it's so late. Now she was 81, 82 at this point. And she said, but I don't think I can make it. And we said, well, we wish you could, but, just go home and be safe. Well, the next thing I found out was that not only did Della go, she stayed for the first set, the second set, and had not one, but two glasses of red wine. Now, I call that a role model. Now, I could go on to say a lot of things about Della and her multiple identities and pursuits, and continue savoring her moment. Those were her words. But I can also imagine Della telling me to get on with it because she wanted to hear our next guest. And I'm indeed eager to get on with my conversation with our guest today, who is a critical voice for any time, but especially in these challenging times. I'm going to shorten his voluminous bio in the interest of hearing what he has produced from them. And I'm going to give you just the highlights of the things that has resulted in his being one of the leading voices in our time through his pioneering work on race and racism, including being the author of 4 books. And How to Be an Anti-Racist was #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. And prior to that, he won the 2016 National Book Award for nonfiction for Stamped from the Beginning, the definitive history of racist ideas in America. And then there are tons of essays and academic journals. And at just, I think it's 38 years old, you can correct me if I've added wrong, but that's what I think it is. Professor Kendi had already established a legacy at more than 6 universities up and down the East Coast. And he is currently the Andrew W. Mellon Professor in the Humanities at Boston University and the founding director of the BU Center for Anti-Racist Research. And last year, Time Magazine named Dr. Kendi one of the most influential people in the world. That's pretty awesome. Isn't that what you all say, Dr. Kendi? That's your term, awesome. I'm trying to be woke, like your generation. And as I indicated earlier, I could go on with all the amazing things that he's done, but I am eager to share with all of you. So Professor Kendi, let me welcome you to Della Hardman Day. And since I have mentioned how much Della loved music, I'm going to start our conversation with what is for sure an overlong question, but it takes me back to Black music, which I think over the years has been a source of social commentary for us, as we were reminded most recently in Summer of Soul, that riveting Questlove production now in theaters and on Hulu. And it includes Nina Simone singing a song that could be timely today. It's called Mr. Backlash. And it goes, Mr. Backlash, Mr. Black Backlash, just who do you think I am? You raise my taxes, freeze my wages. You give me second-class houses and second-class schools. Do you think that all colored folks are just second-class fools? That's Nina singing. And then that was 1967. After the civil rights movement had generated new laws aimed at ending racial discrimination. But then 4 years later, in 1971, Marvin Gaye recorded What's Going On? And some of those songs talked about brother, brother, brother. There are far too many of you dying. And then he goes on to talk about picket lines and picket signs. And I'm thinking about Black Lives Matter. Now, I know you have solutions, but I first want to ask you, why do you think we have to ask in this day, all those years after Gaye and Simone sang those songs, why are we having to answer what's going on or even ask what's going on?
I think the unfortunate truth is that at the same time, there has been a tremendous amount of progress, since Nina Simone sung that song, and we can see that progress, and we've documented that racial progress. What we're only finding out now, many of us, or what we're also people are learning, is that there's also been sort of what I call in my work racist progress. And so over the course of the last 50 years, racist ideas and policies have become more sophisticated. And what that means is an idea that, let's say, Black people are the problem or Black people are inferior. The ideas suggesting that have become more sophisticated over time, which makes it even harder for people to resist them, or policies. Now you have people who claim they're against all forms of discrimination, and those are the very same people who are pushing voter suppression policies and in states across this country, and then claiming those of us who are trying to create more equity and justice are the real racists, because we're talking about racism or identifying racism as a problem. We're in a very difficult time here, and certainly we're in a time of backlash.
What do you think has provoked that?
So I think there's a number of different factors, but I mean, if you take the case of voter suppression, I think it just comes down to power, and it comes down to certain elected officials recognizing that the ideology of the country, that the demographics of the country, are shifting, away from them. And I mentioned both demographics and ideology because we speak a lot about the browning of the nation. We haven't spoke as much about more and more older and younger people becoming more progressive just in general, according to polling data. And so, specifically, Republicans recognizing that older white conservatives, which have largely been the backbone of their party, no longer maintaining a governing sort of majority. And so when you don't have enough votes to win, some people are like, okay, I'm going to broaden my appeal. And others, and I think too many elected officials today are saying, well, I'm going to suppress the votes of my political opponent. And then I'm going to justify those voter suppression policies by claiming there's widespread voter fraud, that those Black people voting in Atlanta or Detroit or Philadelphia, or those Latinx people voting in Phoenix or in Nevada and places in Nevada are fraudulent, that they're corrupt, that they're anti-American, that they're trying to destroy this country, just as people coming from Haiti or El Salvador are, as well, which then causes people, particularly their constituents, to see people of color as the problem, rather than the attacks on democracy itself as the problem.
Well, you used an interesting word a few minutes ago. I think it was a phrase. You talked about the browning of America. I guess that's a phrase more than a word. But I wonder, given that our population is growing in a Black and brown way, as we've seen in so many analyses. And I'm just wondering, is there any evidence to suggest that there's fear about Black and brown people becoming a majority in this country? How much of you think the pushback that we're getting might be related to that? Because sometimes I think that's too sophisticated, but I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I think that is certainly part of the story, and it's part of the story because particularly white Americans, just as even non-white Americans, are taught that there's this zero sum. And Heather McGhee writes about this in her new book called The Sum of Us. We're taught this idea that as Black and brown white Americans are taught this idea that as Black and brown people gain, white people lose. And so if you hold to that belief, then your pundits and media personalities and politicians and ministers are saying, you see all these Black and brown people physically gaining, as well as materially gaining, as well as gaining power, then you're going to just ordinarily believe that you're losing. But the irony, and I think this is what what happens when we are not taught about America's racial history, and there are attacks on that teaching today, is when you actually look at when Black people have actually gained, white folks have gained in this country too. So whether you're talking about the Reconstruction era, where so many working class and middle class whites who were dominated totally almost by the slaveholding class during slavery, was able to now rise into positions of power, were able to establish public schools, were able to break the back of the Confederates. And so they gained, or even during the period from the New Deal to the Civil Rights era, where you had the explosion of the white middle class, because that was the most white middle class, because that was the most egalitarian economically period in this country's history. And then there's been a reversal, in growing amounts of income inequality and wealth inequality across races, but even within white America, as a result of the rollback of civil rights programs.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but you have made some very good points. And, I was going to save this for last if we had time to get to it, but, you bring up the lack of education of people. And I'm looking at this debate over critical race theory, and I'm thinking, is it that, why are they fighting that? And why hasn't the education system helped both Black and brown and white people understand the importance of teaching what you just talked about, Black history? Do people not understand what has happened in this country to Black people, white people, brown people in reality?
I think the unfortunate truth is, in most states around this country, it is elected officials who are deciding the curriculums in schools. And most of those elected officials want an education that's taught that is going to be hospitable to their own political interests. So to give an example, if you are an elected official who've been claiming all along that the Civil War was not about slavery, and that Confederates fought for states' rights, and you're pushing back against the removal of Robert E. Lee's statue in Charlottesville or other sort of removals, you're not going to want an accurate teaching of the Civil War to be taught, because that's going to undermine you, politically. You're not going to want people to learn about, I mentioned earlier, the Reconstruction era and the way in which voter fraud was used to justify the disenfranchising of Black people, because people are going to make the direct connection to today.
Yeah, that's so interesting, because I was just reading, I'm cleaning out my files, and I came across an article from last year I had saved, which quoted a woman named Jane Elliott, an 86-year-old white woman from Iowa who's gone all over the country attacking racism. And she says that racism is ignorance based on being miseducated. And she went on to say it's the result of being indoctrinated instead of educated. That's exactly what you were just saying, right?
It's precisely, and it harkens back to a book written by a Black historian named Carter G. Woodson called The Miseducation of the Negro in 1933, in which even he was not only writing about the ways in which white Americans are miseducated, but even Black Americans are miseducated into believing that white people are superior, and how that's undermining the Black struggle.
Mm-hmm. That's fascinating. Because you have the other situation where the Black Lives Matter movement has resonated among Black people, but it has also provoked a pushback from some white people who say white lives matter. I mean, further widening the racial divide. How do you narrow that divide, especially when our young people are being, as we just said, in many instances, miseducated?
Yeah, I think it's tough, and because so unfortunately, for some people, when I say Black Lives Matter, they hear me saying white lives do not matter.
Do not matter.
Which is just, if people wanted to say white lives don't matter, they would just say that. They're saying Black Lives Matter. And I think what I've tried to convey to people, and particularly people with an open mind, is the context in which that is being said. And so, if we even take this out of race and think about, like, for instance, my family, and this is a true story, my family has been just, ravaged by cancer. And almost every American family has had to face sort of cancer, but certain families have had to face far more or higher levels of cancer. And so if I was to say to someone else's who has another family, but their levels of cancer deaths don't equate to mine, that, well, my family's life matter. I'm not saying their family's lives don't matter. I'm responding to all the people in my family who have died. But because of a lack of empathy, particularly across racial lines, particularly for Black people who die, I think that's part of the reason why people are responding in this way.
And if you look, I suspect if you look at the COVID statistics, who is having the most difficulty with getting vaccinating or dying? And you mentioned the word empathy. Why isn't that being conveyed? Is our media at fault? Who's at fault for this misinformation and this ongoing buildup, actually, of racism, if that's accurate?
Yeah, I think it's probably all of the above. I mean, I know as it relates to specifically vaccinations, what was fascinating was we learned pretty early on, there was a suspicion that some Black folks would be hesitant to get the vaccine because of the relationship that Black people have historically to either the government or the medical establishment. And so then but what actually was the case was, particularly white evangelicals and white Republicans were the most likely, even at the beginning, to be hesitant to get the vaccine. But it became a story, Black hesitancy, and it was specifically a story about Black people being hesitant. But then when it was discussed as it related to white folks, it was Republicans or conservatives, but it wasn't. I'm sure it was. And when there really should have been a specificity of actually white evangelicals, because it wasn't evangelicals, Black evangelicals have less vaccine hesitancy levels. And so, for whatever reason, when it comes to white people, especially if we're not talking about the white working class, people don't want to talk about race. But when as it relates to Black people, they do. And also, and the last thing I'll say is, what was ironic, specifically about vaccines, is the decision of the United States government, which I thought was a right one, to provide vaccine first to elderly Americans. And when I say it was a right one, because elderly Americans were the most vulnerable and had died at the highest rates, we also did not talk about that. When you look at the elderly population in this country, it's disproportionately white, and like the most common age of a white American, I think, is something like 50 or 65, while for Black folks and Latinx folks and Asian folks, it's a quarter of that. And so we were disproportionately vaccinating white Americans, but nobody wanted to talk about that. But then when we started talking about, what, Black folks have died at the highest rates, so maybe we should think about providing vaccine first to Black elderly people or to Black people. It was, oh, no. Let's not talk about race, or that's a form of discrimination, or that's a handout. But it wasn't considered a handout, as it shouldn't have been, or preferential treatment when we, of course, vaccinated elderly people first. I'm not sure if you're getting what I'm saying, but it's just, to me, the double standard.
Right. You know, I'm thinking about, I can't think of his name right now. There's a young brother who has a podcast. Acho, I think is his last name. You must know who I'm talking about. And he said something very interesting not long ago, that we all got, in effect, we all got too complacent. We went into our little corners after the end of the civil rights movement, and we felt it's over, the work is done. And then we went off and, in effect, segregated ourselves. What happened? Did we get too complacent?
Actually, I mean, I think there certainly were individuals who are complacent, but then on the other hand, when you look at the activism that emerged in the 70s and 80s and 90s, I mean, these were some of the most powerful periods of activism, in American history. And I don't think those activists from the 70s, 80s, and 90s get enough credit, because of course we focus on 60s and 50s because of, the achievements of Brown and the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act. But, there were some powerful activist groups, during that sort of period. And I think that period, and what people, in many ways, people were fighting against the backlash that we talked about earlier.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But in your voluminous work, you've provided not only a refreshing analysis, which we're hearing today, of the problem of ongoing racism, you've also provided some fresh solutions aimed at narrowing, if not closing, the racial divide and helping all people of all colors find a way to overcome racism. How to be, here's your book, How to Be Anti-Racist. So how optimistic are you that we can ever create a just and equitable society in which we can feel good enough to, as Della would say, savor the moment?
So I feel that, at least personally, I feel that I have to remain optimistic and hopeful. And the reason being is because, at least personally, I don't feel as if I could gather the strength and the energy and the might to bring about change if I don't believe change is possible. And so in many ways, for me, the belief that we can do the impossible, we can make the impossible possible, is sort of what fuels me. And also, I, as an historian, and as a student of history, I draw strength and inspiration from times in the past in which the impossible happened. And so, of course, people all over the world are talking about, recently the president of Haiti was, of course, assassinated. And when I think of, an historical sort of moment that was impossible. I mean, one of the first things that I think of is the Haitian Revolution. And you're talking about how in 1791, Haiti was the most profitable colony in the European colonized world. And so more profitable than any other colony. And the enslaved Africans there rose up, and in the course of 13 years, not only defeated the largest army that ever left the shores of France, but also defeated armies from England and Spain, and defeated those armies in succession with no military training to declare independence in 1804. It's the most impossible story, but they did it. Just as people in this country did the impossible when we ended chattel slavery.
So you're optimistic that the moment that we find ourselves in, where it seems to be a widening divide between the races, can be narrowed?
Yes, and I'm actually even more optimistic now than I was 2 to 3 years ago. And the reason being is because we have a majority of Americans, according to polls, are saying that systemic racism exists and it's a problem. And it's just,
and excuse me, by systemic racism, because I keep hearing people saying, what do you mean by systemic racism? So define that and keep going with your thought. I hope I didn't interrupt it.
sure. So I define systemic racism, or really racism, as a powerful collection of policies that lead to racial inequities and are substantiated by ideas of racial hierarchy. And so essentially you have a community, you have an institution, you have a society with widespread racial inequity, and people look at that inequity as normal because they believe the people on the lower end of those inequities are inferior. That's racism in a systemic way. And I guess the majority of Americans are recognizing the existence of racism and recognizing it as a problem. And it's important for us to know that 20 years from now, that governing majority didn't exist. It didn't exist 50 years ago. It didn't exist, even during the time of abolition. And that's partly why the propaganda and the lies today among those who are trying to conserve racism, is so vicious, is so horrific, because they know they're losing the grip of this country.
So you're going to have, and I guess this is about my last question to you, although I could talk to you for the rest of the day, but I imagine you have things to do. Our friends on the Vineyard who would have been with us in person at the Della Hardman Day are Black and white and brown and gay and straight. What message do you want to leave with them on this very special day? You were hopeful a minute ago, and don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think people are looking for something that is inspiring and hopeful. So what would you say?
Well, I mean, what I would say is, obviously I didn't have the pleasure and the honor of meeting Della. But from what I've read and from what I even learned even more today is that, she seemed to be the type of person who brought joy to the world. And I think it's important for us to know that in order to be like her and to do like her at a more societal and systemic level, we have to create, a just and equitable world that can sort of normalize sort of joy, as well as opposed to normalizing so much hurt and pain, and misery. And I think the problem is not humans. Certainly, there are people that we probably don't appreciate, but what we can create a different type of world. We can create a different type of world where and that's the type of world that I'm seeking to commit to create. And I just want to encourage other people to imagine that type of world, and for us to collectively put in the efforts to create it.
Well, putting in the effort is a critical phrase, and I'm hoping that the people you see in your work at the university and in the books that you write and in the appearances like this will take heart from you. And if you don't mind me going back to that old saying, keep on keeping on. Thank you so much, Ibram X. Kendi, and all the best to you in your future endeavors.
You're welcome. Thank you so much, Charlayne.
Della Hardman was my next door neighbor, and she was so many things. She was a weaver, she was an artist, she painted, she made jewelry, she was a ceramicist, and she was a writer. And for many years, she was simply my neighbor until we got to know each other a little bit better. When Dorothy West retired from being the Vineyard Gazette columnist for the town of Oak Bluffs, Della took her place. And Della loved to go down to the post office to interview people. She loved people. She loved all of humankind, as a matter of fact. She was just so wonderful at conversing, and she she would get up and get herself all dolled up to go downtown. And my partner Keith and I, living next door, we we would hear her get ready to go out the driveway every single day, and she would rev up that old Wagoneer of a thing that she had, and she would she would blow bluestone all across the yard as she roared down the dirt road. And Keith would always say, Della's going to the post office, and every morning. And when she got down there, she interviewed everybody she met. She would stand outside of the post office, and she would introduce all of the summer visitors that she was meeting and conversing with to all of her neighbors and the other residents from the town that were coming out of the post office, and introduce everybody. And so she would always have a cluster of people around her. As time went on with Della, there were all kinds of things that we would do. And one of the things that would happen was that she started to come to visit with her students. She'd been a professor at West Virginia State University, and her former students adored her. And when they came to visit her, they honored her by dressing to the nines. Della would pack them all up in the car and rip down my driveway, which is about 200 feet of dirt, So she would come in a dust cloud, and they would all come spilling out. And I have never been a morning person. So when Della arrived, I'd be standing out in the yard with a hose in one hand, a cup of coffee in the other, my hair all standy up from not having combed it yet, and some kind of morning dress out in the yard, thinking I was going to be by myself. And then Della would arrive with her entourage, and when she started to introduce you to each other, she had always done her homework. So she would tell each one by one. Each person sort of stood tall in their shoes and was presented to the rest of us, even though some of them knew each other and I never knew any of them. And she would speak about where they came from, what their name was, what kind of education they had finished, and then she would talk about what job they were doing and their current achievements and what projects they were working on. And when Della was presenting 6 to 9 people, everyone simply had to wait their turn and just be quiet and let Della orate. Well, they were all looking beautiful, made up hair, beautiful clothing, and I'm standing there looking like I just stepped out of some rag bag. And one day I went to Della's house after many of these introductions, and I said, Della, can I just be the next door neighbor? I mean, I'm standing there looking, pretty awful when everybody comes looking like fashion plates, like they just stepped off a magazine. I said, can I just be the neighbor when you do the introductions? And she cut me a look, and she said, Susan, the way she always had this little squeak at the end of her voice, have you had to sacrifice nothing for whom you became? I said, Della, we all know people sacrifice when they're artists, but you know the story, so yeah, of course. She said, well, if you're not going to remember who you are and what it took to get there, I guess I'm going to have to remind you regularly. And I knew from then on to keep my mouth shut and just let Della do what Della does. And that was to introduce us all and make us stand tall, make us really be proud of who we were and what we had done. And to not step back from that, to really take your place in the sun, even if it was for just that one moment in the morning, no matter what you were wearing. Well, one day I was on my way over to her house again because she loved to bake, and so she would take a half a day off and she would bake a whole bunch of pound cakes, and then she would distribute them through the neighborhood. And I was bringing a pan back, a loaf pan, and when she would do the distribution, she would talk to the handymen in the neighborhood, and she would negotiate with them to do odd jobs here and there for her and keep everything working. It was one of her ways that she kept the entrepreneurs busy. So as time went on, she had gone to her reunion at college, and she bumped into her high school boyfriend, Leon, and they had gone their separate ways during the Second World War, and each married other people and had families, and they both were widowed. And, well, they fell in love again, and sure enough, she married Leon, and then the neighborhood got lively, and he was so wonderful, and just so so much a consummate gentleman. He really was quite lovely, and the the things that worked with the two of them sort of spread around the rest of us. There was some kind of energy between them that gave all of us hope that you could live life well. And she was always saying, savor the moment. Well, she was certainly savoring the moment when she met Leon again. And it was on her answering machine. It was the last thing she would say on the answering machine. And so as time went on and the the dogs walked the two of them, mostly they walked Leon. Leon would be running down, chasing the dog on the end of the leash because the dogs are so strong. And he was with us for a while, and then Leon passed away, and it was such a hardship for us all. And I had a dream about him a few weeks after he died, and I went over to see Della to see how she was doing and to tell her that I had had a dream. And I said, so Della, you doing all right? And she said, I'm fine, dear. I said, you're fine. After all this time, you finally meet and marry Leon, and then he's gone, and you're fine? She said, Susan, we all make the mistake of thinking that we came to stay. I've made my peace with that a long time ago. I'm fine. Would you like to have a little pound cake? So she was fine. And I was so surprised by her ability to take everything in stride. She was so excited about any time the grandchildren would come, Andrea, Faith, or Buddy and their children. And one day she called me and she said, I'm going away and I'm going to be gone for 3 weeks. And I need someone to write the column, and I'd like that to be you. I said, Della, I, you know, I'm really not the town columnist. I don't write to deadline very well. And I certainly don't write every week like that. And she said, oh, really? And I said, well, yeah. Could you get somebody else? She said, well, what would you write if you had the opportunity? Well, Della and I had both been writing. She had gone back to college to get her PhD when she was in her late 60s. And so when she was in her early 70s and it was around 93, I was writing my first book and she was writing her dissertation. And though we didn't ever discuss the content, we would take from that lonely endeavor, because writing leaves you alone a lot, some solace during the night, because we both were night owls and we could see each other's winter lights twinkling through the trees deep into the night, and we knew that each the other was writing. So she knew that I could do this, but instead she asked me what I would write, and I said, well, actually, at this point, I would write about how much the vineyard is changing, how rapidly it's changing, and how the culture is being affected, and that bothers me a great deal, and something needs to be said about that. And she said, well, in that case, I think you should write that, and you should give it to me by noon tomorrow. I said, but click, she was gone. So I thought, well, I just told her I couldn't write to deadline, and here she gives me an assignment. So I went right to work on it. I just skipped what I was doing, and I wrote a piece on what it would mean for the island if we put our collective selves together and thought in terms of using common sense to build a common story. And in that way, we would work for the common good. So I emailed it to her the next day. And within a half an hour, I got a phone call. I thought it was going to be Della, but it was not. It was Mr. Reston from the Gazette. And he said, Susan, this is not a column. And I said, who is this? He said, this is Mr. Reston. I said, oh, no, it's not a column. And Della asked me to write a column, but I said no. And then she said, what would you write? And this is what I wrote. And he said, yes, and it's not a column. I said, but I'm aware of that. I didn't realize she was going to give it to you. He said, what it is it's an op-ed piece, and I want to give it a half page with a photograph. I was stunned. But there was Della again, making sure that you took the opportunity to stand in your own shoes, stand tall, and own it. So it did appear. And It had a wonderful response. So it wasn't too long after that, actually, that Della got word that she was having some troubles with her heart, and she called me and told me, and she said, "And guess what? Faith is coming with Solomon and Romero from Atlanta." She was so excited, and they came to stay with her and to be her support while she went through whatever she needed to do with this new set of circumstances. Well, Faith was lovely and quiet, as was Solomon. Solomon was very contained as a boy, and he was polite and quiet. Romero, on the other hand, at 7, was already a man of the boulevard. This child could ask questions 100 times a day, and he loved hanging out with Keith and me, and he would come over, and of course, because he was bred in the South, he would call Keith Mr. Keith, and I was Miss Susan. And sure enough, he would come over and badger us with questions, and we'd have these wonderful conversations. Well, one day I came into the part of the road where the macadam turns into dirt, and Romero was there, and he flagged me down. And I said, "What's up, Romero?" He said, "This is now a toll road." I said, "Oh, really?" And I guess that means that someone should be collecting a toll. Is that correct? He said, "Yes, it is, and I'm collecting." I said, "Really, Romero, what's the price?" He said, "Well, I think we ought to talk about that." I said, "Sure. What are you thinking?" He said, "No, what are you thinking?" I said, "I'm thinking 15 cents. He said, "I think that sounds good." So I dug in my bag and got out a dime and a nickel, and I gave him the 15 cents. He was quite happy with that and let me pass. So when I got home, I called Della and I said, "Della, this is not a complaint. It's only an observation, and I think you probably would know, you would like to know, that Romero has set up an invisible toll booth at the beginning of the road, and he's charging people to use the byway." She said, "Oh, I hope that child did not beat you out of any money." I said, "Yes, he did. It was 15 cents, and I was glad to pay it." She said, "Susan, don't encourage that." I said, "Della, you're the one who told me we're supposed to support our entrepreneurs. I was just taking your example." And she said, "Oh, that child." I said, "Della?" She said, "Yes." I said, "Savor the moment." So she hung up, and by the end of the afternoon, it was a free byway, and Romero was out of business. Well, it turned out that it was a couple of years that they stayed, and then Della's health got worse, and then eventually, in 2005, we lost both Keith and Della within months of each other, and it was a really, really difficult time. And I kept trying to remember what she had said, that we all make the mistake of thinking that we came to stay. It was tough, but Della had given us so much, and she taught us all so many different kinds of things. And then, not long after that, her students from West Virginia, they inaugurated a movement to get a celebration of Della and her life and all of her contributions. And that's how Della Hardman Day was born. And several years later, after the celebrations had been happening in the park, in Ocean Park in Oak Bluffs, I was taking a bunch of books to the post office to mail out some orders. And as I was approaching it, the day is in July, and so it's always very busy downtown. And as I was approaching the post office, there was a man standing in front of the post office talking to a woman, and the great banner of Della Hardman Day was up down by the police station, and there were posters all over the place with Shel Silverstein's wonderful flower that he had done for Della. And the woman was standing there, and she said to the man, "So who is this Della Hardman?" And he said, "Who is Della Hardman?" And he launched. And I went into the post office because I had a whole bunch of business to take care of in there. And about 20 minutes later, when I had finished, I came out, and he was still talking to her. And when he was winding down, he said, "And that's who Della Hardman is. And I met her on this very spot." And that's the story of Della. as one of the finest neighbors anyone could ever wish to have.